Hello, and welcome to an introduction to learning segments and lesson planning. So to get us started, let's actually talk about what we're going to be talking about in today's video. We're going to kind of run this a little bit like a workshop, even though we're doing this asynchronously. So I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit more informally and show you some examples and such. So by the end of this video, what we're going to be doing is being able to define learning segment. You're going to be able to define the parts and purposes of a lesson plan. I want to go into some of the theories behind the traditional Hunter model of lesson planning. And then we're going to talk through some edits that we might make to a sample lesson plan so that it could meet the substitute rule. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the substitute rule toward the end of the video. But just as a quick definition up front, when we lesson plan, when we think about any of our plans, we need to be able to not only use this document, this lesson plan, when we teach, but we also have to be able to structure it and make it useful for anybody who has to teach our class. So if I were to come into your class and be your substitute, I want to be able to take your plans and actually execute your lesson. So it needs to be deep enough that a substitute could use it, but flexible enough and outlined enough that you can actually use it during your own instruction. So what's a learning segment? A learning segment is a cohesive set of lessons that's focused on students' mastery of three things. One is one topic. Two, one standard. And three, measures one summative assessment. Okay? So if I were to set up usually 3 to 5 lessons goes into a learning segment, it might be more. 3 is probably the absolute minimum for a learning segment. Otherwise, you just have 2 lesson plans. So you have 3 to 5 lessons. That's what the EdTP is going to require you to do anyway. You're going to set this up around one topic. So let's say it's going to be, the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a favorite example of mine. You're going to have one standard. So throughout the whole 3 to 5 lessons, you're only working on one state standard. And then by the end of that learning segment, students will complete a summative assessment that's going to measure their mastery over that one topic and that one standard. Now, that doesn't mean that the summative assessment at the very end of that learning segment is the only assessment you're going to do. Throughout every single one of your lessons, you should have one or more formative assessments, really marking students' progress. As a teacher, there are going to be so many times when you're going to teach a lesson and you're going to think, oh, that was great. We had so much fun. It was so interactive. But then you get that formative assessment back and you go, oh man, they didn't get what I wanted them to get. And so your next lesson, you're going to have to modify your next lesson to kind of make up for that or figure out a different way of approaching it. So those formative assessments are really important for you to throw in each lesson so that you know the extent of the progress students are making so that you can change things as needed as you continue to move toward addressing that standard, addressing that topic, and quite frankly, just having them be successful on the summative assessment. Throughout all of this, you're also going to be including disciplinary ways of thinking, disciplinary texts. So in social studies, we use a lot of primary source documents. So all these things are going to be brought into these 3 to 5 lessons that we're calling a learning segment. So where does all this fit in? So we have national, you might call them national standards, the Common Core standards. And really, our state standards are aligned to Common Core. Then you might have, those are kind of funneled down into district curriculum, what's going to be taught across this district. And then at the school level, sometimes this should be in connection with the district, but at the school level you have units of instruction. So let's say that if I'm teaching, the ancient world, maybe in quarter 1, my big unit is going to be the ancient world of Mesopotamia, right? And then maybe quarter 2 is going to be around Egypt, and then quarter 3 is going to be Greece, and then quarter 4 is going to be Rome. So those are my big units. Our goal as teachers then is to look at that bigger unit and say, okay, how am I going to break this up into learning segments? So what standards, topics, and assessments, summative assessments, am I going to kind of clump together to cover that whole unit? And then what makes up our learning segments? Well, our smallest unit of writing as teachers is the lesson. What's going to happen in the day-to-day to get us to the unit that allows us to fulfill the requirements, lesson to learning segment that allows us to fulfill the requirements of that unit, that allows us to fulfill the requirements of the district curriculum, and that's going to be connected to those state standards. So all of these are nested, but really in this video we're going to really be talking about the learning segment and really truly the lessons that underpin those learning segments. And so this is just another graph or chart that might help you understand a little bit about how those things are actually nested. So where do we start? Lesson planning starts with two very related things, okay? So the very first thing that we've already talked about in class are the standards. And this is using the NJSLS for us in New Jersey, and they are going to guide everything that we do. Standards get a bad rap, I think. Look, I don't know of a single teacher or district administrator who's going to say that all the standards are complete and whole. Look, they were made by humans in time, place, context, right? No divine being came down and said these are the standards for social studies. So they're incomplete. But here's where I think they get a bad rap. Just because they're incomplete doesn't mean that they aren't good and useful. So these standards were created by teachers, by district administrators, by professors who sat down and said, okay, in our finite amount of time, in our context, what do students need to be able to do in order to be good citizens? And so here are our standards. So everything that you're going to do is going to be aligned to a standard. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, the lesson plan needs to be related to a summative assessment for your learning segment. Okay? So you might do something like this, and this is just a one-pager that we're going to be using in class. So you get the, what's your name and all stuff. What we want to do is be able to say, okay, the summative assessment and the standard should go together. So if the standard says, let's use my Emancipation Proclamation example. If the standard says students are going to be able to compare and contrast two or more documents to show perspective about a historical event. Well, okay, I can do that with the Emancipation Proclamation. So my summative assessment would be something like using two or more primary source documents provided in the learning segment. You're going to be able to compare. Remember, so compare was like the operative verb in the standard. So compare is going to be the operative verb in my summative assessment. These primary source documents to express the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them write a comparison essay, right? The standard said to compare two or more documents. In my summative assessment, I'm going to have them compare two or more documents. Well, so what does this look like? Well, maybe day one we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Maybe we read through it a little bit. Lesson 2, I'll give them a primary source document with, let's say a soldier's explanation or understanding of it. Lesson 3, I'll give them a different perspective. So maybe lesson 2 is the Union soldier, lesson 3 is from a Confederate soldier. In lesson 4, maybe I'll have them do a Venn diagram so they can really start to practice what that comparison looks like, what's similar and different. And then in lesson 5, here, I'm just going to have them do this summative assessment. Because let's face it, if I send it home, it probably ain't coming back. That's it. That's a learning segment, and that's how all of these things are tied together. Okay? But you can't lesson plan without those things. Once you have those things, we can get into the actual lesson plan. Okay, we can actually talk about, okay, I know what I want to do in lessons 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What is that going to look like? And so when we lesson plan, our lesson plan, call it a lesson plan, but it really has two components. Some of the components are related to the learning segment. Some of the components are related to the lesson. And this is really important because we want, one, we don't want to confuse the two, but two, remember our lesson plans are nested in the learning segment. So if I'm looking at just a lesson plan, I need some context, and the context comes from these related learning segment pieces. So in a second, I'm going to show you a template. But for now, we're going to say that in the lesson plan, there are some things that are related to the learning segment. That's going to be your central focus. So you can, if you're taking notes, I would write central focus equals topic, your standard, your summative assessment, and language function, which is something that you talked about in 319, and we can get into a little bit in class. But for right now, those are the things related to the learning segment. Most of the lesson plan, though, is actually related to the lesson. So things that are related to the lesson are mastery objectives. By the end of this class, students will be able to bop, bop, bop. And so I would keep it to no more than 3 mastery objectives for the entire lesson. Why? Because as an administrator, I'm going to want to, you're saying these are mastery objectives. You're saying that these things are really important to measure student progress. So for every mastery objective you have, I'm going to expect a formative assessment. Now that might be dipsticking, asking random students throughout the class to provide an answer. It might be an exit ticket at the end of the lesson. It might be a worksheet, but for every mastery objective, you need to have a formative assessment. You need to put in there about some language demands. So great, social studies is probably one of the hardest subjects to teach when it comes to language demands. We're handing students primary source documents from, ancient times with weird English that they don't really get, and sometimes it's not even English. Maybe it's a different language than translated in different formats. Sometimes it's hard to read. You get the palimpsest, right? So like when, not even ancient peoples, but peoples just a couple hundred years ago would reuse paper, and so you see like the ink running through and over top of each other. It's really hard. So when it comes to language demands, we want to know what vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. What's going to trip students up? And so we need to be cognizant of that in this lesson. Then we get to our learning activities. So usually you have a do now, or a warm up or anticipatory set, whatever you want to call it, to get students connected and interested in the lesson. A learning activity per objective, and then a closure. And then finally you have materials. So let's take a look at this. What does this look like? After you complete your 1-pager, this is kind of the lesson planning template. And we're going to take a look at the end of this video, toward the end of this video, of one that doesn't look exactly like this, but I think it'll be helpful for you. So you have your name and all that stuff. The things that are highlighted are learning segment related. So what's your central focus or topic for this learning segment? What's your standard? What's your summative assessment? And then you see language function down here. Everything else is learning or is lesson plan related. So your mastery objectives, students, SWBAT, students will be able to, and you can write that. Everybody knows what that stands for. And then here are your 3 objectives. So I had identify X, analyze Y, evaluate Z. Here, we're talking about our assessments, and here we're talking about our formative assessments for this lesson, because your summative assessment's all the way up here, and that's for your learning segment. You have your language demands. So what are those demands? Vocabulary demands, syntax, and discourse demands of the instructional materials you're providing. And then how are you going to support specific students? So it's really not good enough to say, Oh, I have challenging vocabulary. So just as a whole class, we're going to do a word wall. Word walls are great, absolutely. But if I have some students who maybe are English language learners, or I have students with auditory processing disorders, visual processing disorders, any of these things, I want to also be able to say, okay, I'm going to do a word wall for the whole class. That's a good thing. Um, but what other things am I going to do to really support students who, speak a different language in my class? Are we going to do some translation work? What does that look like? So I want, in these boxes here, I really want to think about the students I'm teaching and how I'm going to support them. Then we get into our instructional strategies. So you're due now, your learning activities. Remember, we want a learning activity, one per objective. That's a good general rule. And in our learning activities, we want to say at least two things. One, what is the teacher going to do? And what are the students going to do? So if I'm going to show a video in class, I'm going to say teacher shows video and tell how I'm going to show it. If it's a link, welcome to Google Docs, right? I can just plug in the link. So I'm going to show this. Great. Now, what are the students going to do? Are they going to take notes? If they're going to take notes, what are they going to take notes on? Is there a worksheet that I might have them jot some notes, because I kind of really want them to pay attention, but I also want them to capture certain things. So maybe I have a handout that I'm going to hyperlink in here, so that, again, following that substitute rule, right? I know what the students are going to do while I know what I'm going to do as the substitute. So we have our learning activities, our closure. Honestly, this is usually an exit slip related to those three objectives. So if our last objective up here is to evaluate something, I might be asking students to evaluate something on the exit ticket, because that's going to be a really easy, tangible way for me to formatively assess students. And then down below, I'm not really sure why we put, this is a pretty common feature of lesson plans, but we put all of our supports, accommodations, and modifications for students down here. I don't know why. Honestly, I think it would be much better up at the top, because it would help you plan for students, but whatever, I don't make the rules. Here though, we want to make sure that we're reaching all of our students. So our ELLs, our IEPs 504s, advanced students. And the one that gets me, and I think is actually probably so overlooked so often, is the students who are struggling, who don't have IEPs or 504s, aren't ELLs. They might also be our advanced students, but they struggle in particular areas. So for me, I'm a slow reader, and it just always takes me more time. Doesn't mean anything about my intellect, but how are you going to support students who aren't going to get through the entire primary source document that you want them to read? Like, where's that cutoff point? What's acceptable, right? Down here, we put any teacher materials and student materials, and then homework if you assigned it. So this is a general template for lesson planning. And you see how the lesson plan and the learning segment kind of go together here. So often we pretend that things just are in education, but really the lesson plan, what I just walked through with you, comes from a long line of really good theory and research. So this idea, let's say, of starting with the standard and the summative assessment really comes from backwards design. And this is a term coined by Wiggins and McTighe. But what they did, all they did was they took a step back and said, okay, we know that we need to be able to measure students' progress. So Bloom came up with cognitive taxonomy. You probably learned about that in 250. And we have all these nice verbs of, what students remember, know, apply, create, all that stuff, right? So if that's what we need, then we really need to stop doing what we tend to do and say, today or this week, I'm going to teach about the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's start from day one. Because when we start from day one, we don't necessarily know where we're going to stop. Are we stopping on day 5? Or are we stopping on day 10? And what needs to be what needs to go into all of that stuff. And so between Bloom's taxonomy and then also thinking about the role of formative assessments in student learning, backward design is a really critical concept in helping us know kind of the goal that we want to reach at the end, and then backwards plan how we're going to get there. Related to that, while we're in this learning segment, while we're in the teaching part, right, we need to focus on some cognitive apprenticeship, right? Our job as teachers is to get students to not need us anymore. It's a really weird job, second only to parenting, right? Our job is to make them self-sufficient. And so to do that, we need to be able to show them how we think, how experts in the field think about this. And so one way that is pretty effective, I think people might find it a little boring sometimes, but it's super effective, is using the Hunter model. You might have heard about this as the I do, we do, you do model. So if I'm showing them a particular skill, let's say sourcing a primary source document, right? I might take a primary source document, I might, in front of the class, say, show them the document and then think out loud about how I'm thinking about this document using the different questions that go along with sourcing. And then I might give the class, maybe I'll break them up into smaller groups and say, you do that process together, in small groups, or maybe we do it together as a class. And then finally, I give them a third primary source document and say, okay, now you're going to do it by yourself, and I want to see what you're able to do alone. So the I do, teacher, we do, class, you do, student model is a really nice way of not only cognitively apprenticing students on how experts in the field think, but also assessing their abilities. So let's take a look at a lesson plan. I intentionally selected one that is not from New Jersey, so that you can kind of see a different structure. There's no right or wrong as long as it's usable. So here, this student's going to talk about appeasement in World War II. One thing that I really liked that she did was she put in not only the purpose of the lesson, but also kind of the students' prior academic knowledge and experiences. I'm not sure it's always necessary, but man, as an administrator or as your potential substitute, it's just really nice to have this information about like what's going to happen in this lesson and what do they already know, so that I'm not coming in trying to teach them something that they already know here. This is a lesson plan from New York. In New York, at this time it was a little strange. They were still working on aligning all of their standards with the Common Core. So they had a framework that they used, but then they also used Common Core ELA standards. You're not going to do that. You're going to use the NJSLS, but this is what she was trying to do. She has 3 learning objectives: identify, assess, and evaluate. So that's pretty good. Okay. For academic language, she kind of got confused here. So she's confusing language demands, and then in here you'll see she has language function. I really like the way that the template that I showed you lays that out so that it separates it between language function being something for the learning segment and language demands being for the lesson. One thing that she didn't do well at all was provide any idea of how she was going to support students through any of these language demands. So she might, and quite frankly, she didn't even do a good job with the syntax and discourse. But let's just focus on vocabulary for a second. It's great that all of these are like important vocabulary terms, but how are you going to help students get it? We have some instructional materials, that's cool. And then learning activities. So you notice here they call them instructional strategies, learning tasks, purpose, whatever. They're learning activities. So we have a do now. I think this is, I'm confused by this do now. So she wants to teach them the acronym or mnemonic main rat, right? But I don't know what the students are actually doing in their table groups. Like, if the table group is like, oh, cool, I know what main rat stands for, and they just knock it out, like, what are they talking about? And I'm not sure what possible answers they're talking about unless somebody gets something wrong or really has no idea. And if they really have no idea, main rat means nothing. Like, I don't know what they're doing here. So she really needed to think about that a little bit more. In this 21-minute lesson, notice how none of this is broken up by objective, right? We're going to be showing a video clip in here, but I don't know what the students are going to do. I don't have any real, we have the instructional materials up here. We have the video clip, but I don't know, like, there's no link to the PowerPoint, so I don't know what that is. I really, as a substitute, have no idea what she's doing here, except showing this Munich conference YouTube video, which I do have a link for up top. So that's a big problem. I'm actually not even sure what she's going to do. She keeps saying we. Well, what's the teacher doing? What's the student doing? There's going to be a document study in here, but I really don't know what that is either because I don't have that instructional material. And then the exit ticket, okay, great. So we see a closure, there's an exit ticket, but it doesn't really show, I don't know what the closure is because I don't have the documents. So these are all things that we need to pay attention to. She doesn't do a great job here with detailing who gets what, when, and how when it comes to differentiation, accommodation, and modification. What is kind of cool is here she tries to break things up by objective. But again, I can't use this document because I don't have any of the instructional materials. And here she tries to break things up, at least for IEPs and 504s. But a lot of her accommodations aren't super useful. One, I don't know who the students are that need to be accommodated. Two, I don't know what groups they would fall into. And three, we're going to group students homogeneously. Okay, but that wasn't in the plans. And I'm not sure exactly what that means because I don't know the students. So this lesson is a good start, but it has a lot of issues that are remedied by what we talked about in this video. Thinking about putting in all those little pieces that are going to help a substitute really step in and take this over, or even an administrator being able to look at this and say, oh, I know what this person's going to do in this lesson and how it ties into the learning segment in general. I hope that this video was rather helpful for you. We're going to be doing a lot more work on learning segments and lesson plans in this course. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what this whole thing looks like, what these terms, learning segment and lesson plan, mean, and how we can apply these in our own instruction.